have a permanent record. Um, I've got all sorts of questions, big, questions that are, about large structural things and little questions like what the hell does this word mean? And so I don't know. Um,
You want to start with one of your big ones? That should give us enough gasoline to power through an hour.
these I feel like it's weird. Some of these questions I feel like almost like they're stupid questions. Like after reading this, they ought to have obvious answers. And I'm like, why do I still not understand this? But one of the things I think I have some idea of what he's talking about, but this, he keeps using this word ecstatic and ecstasy, these ecstatic and rapture, at least in the Stambaugh translation. And I assume he's using ecstasy kind of in the Greek sense of, ecstasis, sort of projecting one's self outside of oneself. And so, this business about projecting Dasein is its own possibilities, projecting those. But I guess that's one question I have is, well, the big question I have is what the hell is temporality? But uh, that's a, that's a really big question. So I don't know if somebody like maybe that would be a place to start. What is what does he mean by ecstasy? By these and temporality is ecstatic.
I think Heidegger was just dropping some beans on the weekend, you know, the EDM music and just going for it.
He was probably at a rave, you know. Someone
Exactly.
gave him some ecstasy and he's like, damn.
Yeah. Let's make sure you hydrate. Yeah, okay. No, but really, um yeah, the ecstatic thing, this is another one of these things that I thought I had something of an idea about it before reading it, which is already kind of, I mean, that's a little ecstatic itself, but then I read it and was like, what the hell is this? Like, uh, the best way I can think of it, the way he uses it is that it seems to be okay, there's kind of like these three modalities of temporality: past or having been, present, and future. And so a mode of temporality, which is a lot of what this reading kind of covered, these different inauthentic modes mainly. So any one of those will involve all three of those. I'm not sure exactly what to call them, modalities of time, the having been, past, present, future. So the way that any one of those modalities of time or temporality will involve the other aspects of time, that seems to be the way that he's talking about it, where you can't have just a present that's contained in itself, or especially, uh, my emotions are wrong with my words. You can't have a present that's contained in itself. That's especially the big concern with him because that's how time has traditionally been interpreted, as just simply a kind of present contained in a present container of the now, or you see the past as something kind of like that as well, contained over in its own dimension or whatnot. Um, and then yeah, future, same thing, but I think mainly is concerned would be the present would be something like that. But temporality as the being of Dasein, it's not present at hand. It's not a present thing. It's not an entity. So instead, it's something outside of itself, ahead of itself, because that's what temporality is. Uh, Not in the sense that it's a kind of like passing within the succession of experiences in consciousness. That's way too, that's, Husserl. But he thinks Husserl is wrong about time for the most part. Instead, it's that any one of these modalities of time is already kind of outside itself and all the others. And that's also what gives it this kind of unitary structure, that's also the thing he seems to emphasize when he's talking about the ecstatic nature of it, that it's this whole, it has to do with Dasein's wholeness and temporality as a whole. So that's the best way I can think of it. And there's much of I think another reason why he likes this word is because the etymology is similar to existence. So extends, standing outside of, which is also kind of like the opposite of substance, standing under.
Right.
Or presence is this kind of present at hand, this just standing there, present. So he's trying to like differentiate himself from this like present at hand ontology, while also being able to kind of refer to existence through this like play with etymology.
I concur with everything you've just said, Chase. I was going to add, kind of just as I was thinking of this, just again, I think it's in agreement with yours, just a kind of different way of phrasing it, if you like. The three different modes of temporality, and each attended by the different, what is it? Understanding towards, is primarily, rooted in the future, right? But there's a unitary aspect to this temporality. So each one has a rooted place, but from its rooted place, it ecstatically reaches out into the other, so that past, present, and future are always in a unity. But what starts with the rooted place, and I want to use the word that it's, I know this doesn't happen in the text, this just helps me think of it. In the case of the understanding, which starts with futurity, that futurity then permeates that already have been, the now, or the present, to bring it a unity. So from understanding, the past is already permeated by futurity, and the present is already permeated by futurity. And then when we look at attunement, that's, what is it? Past, right? Is the root, and then futurity is permeated by already having been, or past, and the present is already permeated, right? So I know this word permeated isn't being used as such, but that helps me kind of like think of that ecstatic movement, kind of a filling, and then bringing a unity to.
Is the way you both were talking, when you are envisioning temporality and the sense of having been, present, and future, that's how human beings experience it? And because that's how it really is?
I think that's Heidegger's claim, is that's ontologically primary account of temporality, from which we can then understand why we've developed this vulgar notion of time, which is not adequate to the ontological task. But I think you're right.
Okay.
So,
go ahead, Nevin.
My sense, and then correct me again, as usual, is that, since he's doing this phenomenology, he thinks what's primordial or primary is the way that Dasein experiences being, because that, like we talked about that time where it was just me, you, and Eric, I think, and we were talking about how phenomenology really focuses on this sort of first person experience and takes that as the primary foundation of everything, rather than positing the existence of some other domain that is the ground of objectivity and truth and all that, and then we somehow pop into it. It's that our that the primordial state of things is grounded in our actual experience. And so my sense is that with regard to temporality, our primary way of experiencing temporality, I think he's claiming, is in the way that we project ourselves into the future and the way that we remain open to possibility. And then temporality arises, or I mean, I don't know which, he doesn't like the word arise, shouldn't use that word. So temporality, I don't know what word to use, but comes about because of that projective character of Dasein that is projected toward the future. And so that, so that the primary modes of temporality have to do with the way that Dasein engages in the world. And that's the quote real temporality, or the primordial temporality. And then from that, we have these, we develop these inauthentic derivative modes of temporality, like time as you talk about it in physics or chemistry or whatever, where you imagine the world as a giant space-time box where there's this time that passes and there's this giant space and stuff happens in it, but that's kind of a derivative mode. So some scientists would tell us, no, that's the primary mode. And this stuff you're talking about is just this subjective, distorted, confused thing that really doesn't have anything to do with reality. And it's like phenomenology kind of flips that and says, no, what we have immediate access to is, to use his word, primordial. And that other stuff is what's derivative. And so that's I don't have a very clear idea of temporality, but that it has something to do with the nature of Dasein as always being projected into the future. And so then that futural projection is what kind of becomes the basis for how other modes of temporality, I don't know what the right word is. I don't want to say appear, but anyway, develop. Is that even close, Chase?
Because
Yeah, I would probably want to try to qualify it maybe my own way, but I think those are legit points, yeah.
So how would you explain it, or how would you qualify that? I mean, don't be afraid of telling me I'm wrong, because I'm just guessing here, or trying to figure it out.
can I ask a quick question too, and then explain as well, and then see if this matches up with what Chase is going to say? Because on the 325 section of the Standby, where he's discussing temporality of attunement, he says, and this is the second paragraph: mood discloses by turning away and towards one's own Dasein, whether authentically revealing or inauthentically concealing, bringing Dasein before the that of its own thrownness is existentially possible only if the being of Dasein, by its very meaning, is a constantly having been. Having been does not first bring one face to face with the thrown being that one is oneself, but the ecstasy of having been first makes possible finding oneself in the mood of how I find myself. Understanding is primarily grounded in the future. Attunement, on the other hand, temporalizes itself primarily in having been. And mood temporalizes itself, that is, its specific ecstasy belongs to a future and a present, but in such a way that having been modified, or having been, and I've underlined having been, modifies the equiprimordial ecstasies. And I was thinking about this, like, particularly my past. I never sit back and say, like, boy, my past was significant at some point to me. I never say that. It's always in the terms of the present or right now. And in this particular section, it's like he seems to be saying that the future is meaningful when you look at it as Dasein or I am or my being is coming towards something. The past is meaningful only in the sense that I I am as having been. Like I'm sorry,
You
Was
say
there?
you're drunk?
I'm thinking
no,
maybe
no,
a ferret did something, like attacked him.
it's ferrets and my phone is blowing up and you can hear it through
Um,
there it is again. That's the seventh text message. Cool. Groovy. Um, but it seems like what I'm wondering is if he's saying that the future is meaningful in this I am coming towards something, in that the past is only meaningful in that your present is coming towards something as having been it. And that's really interesting from the perspective of temporality. And there's this, and then is he? I guess I'm asking, is he looking at how Dasein or how the being is related to the sense of the future and the past as how we approach coming towards something and how that affects us, and that the past is only meaningful in the present because it's a differentiation for where I was in my component of Dasein. Like this is where the past is meaningful because it shows where I've been compared to my current Dasein, and the future is meaningful in anticipation because it shows me the potentiality of what I'm going towards.
Yeah, in the reading before this one, I believe, maybe two before, but he talks about meaning again, and in the context of his more or less definition that temporality is the meaning of Dasein's being, which is care, but it's the meaning of care. So what does that mean? Um, well, he gives the rather helpful explanation that meaning has to do with the conditions of possibility for something. So if I say something is the meaning of something, that's the condition of possibility for it to be. So when I read that, I was like, oh, that's quite helpful. I can kind of see how that works. That, well, what does this mean? Well, that's kind of what it's transcendental ground. So looking at it from that perspective, that's usually the way that he's approaching this whole thing about temporality, is that he's saying temporality is this is what is actually giving the conditions of possibility for these various phenomena. And what are phenomena? They're what shows itself in its being. He's got the whole confusing ways of explaining, what phenomena is and phenomenology and whatnot. But I think if you think about it, okay, it does have in some way some kind of connection with what we would normally call just experience. But he wants to, this is where, the heavy weight of the tradition of philosophy, as well as the heavy weight of common sense interpretations of things, the everyday interpretations of things, where we're inauthentic and lost amongst our concerns and whatnot. That means that there's this emphasis on, the subject, the mind, and this interpretation of Dasein in terms of those things. And that's what he wants to get away from. And he sees, for the most, I mean, he uses the word experience, or I can't remember exactly what it is in German, but the thing they almost always translate in German as, or they translate it to English as experience. He does use that word, and but for the most part, I think that idea of experience is something that he's trying to somewhat get away from, for the same reasons he's trying to get away from the language of subject object. But he's still saying something kind of like that. He's giving an alternative theory to that. So what he's saying instead is that phenomena, okay, what are we? We're this kind of just openness onto the world, as being in the world. And then within that openness, which is, the disclosure of the world, then we have things that show themselves as they are in their being. So the way you can think of it as, okay, maybe we have experiences of things, but what really is we're looking for this ontological core that is actually grounding the experience more so than any kind of a obvious kind of immediate interpretation of experience. So the same thing I think would be with temporality, and that he's trying to get to this kind of ontological ground more so for what gives rise to what immediately presents itself as experience. So it's still connected to that, but in a somewhat complicated way, because it's got a whole bunch of conditioning kind of going on there. But the thing about phenomena is that it's kind of crossing this boundary where I'm guessing maybe Kant would be like, what the hell? No, you can't. Nothing shows itself in itself, but that's exactly what he's saying phenomena does do. So somebody like Husserl, or even early Bergson, will talk about time in terms of consciousness, subjectivity, and that's what Heidegger's definitely wants to try to get away from that. So that would be my way of qualifying how he's doing phenomenology, I guess, but also seeing that about what Joseph was saying. I think he's using meaning also in this, as that's kind of the conditioning ground of things, is their meaning. And I think that's what he's saying about temporality, is that, all these structures of Dasein's being that, well, what is it to show itself? It's kind of like the point that's crossing from being to our experience of it is temporality. So it can do it authentically, in its being. That's like real phenomenology, I guess. But also, he's saying that still these inauthentic modes are genuine phenomena, but they don't present themselves immediately as what they are. They present themselves in a way that suggests a different ontology, the ontology of President Hand mostly.
Well,
so, yeah, that's what I would say about that.
I mean, I understand, because you've said this during the conversations about this work of Heidegger. There's been stated more than once that I don't want to put any kind of, anyway, that he's trying to do something different from Husserl. Husserl was with the subjective. Heidegger doesn't want that. He's going for something else, and I don't know if it's not subjective, is it objective? But he is asserting something about the reality of Dasein, right? It is something that exists, and it doesn't exist just because our of our understanding of its existence, right? So I don't know what you would call that type of existence if it transcends any subjectivity. But at the same time, begging your pardon, but if if enough persons experience phenomenon in a similar way, and it seems to be broadly how human beings experience it, then it seems to me that it's not just subjective. I mean, Chase, when you were talking, I was thinking to myself about, my own life and how and not, and I'm my language isn't going to do justice to yours, but the present isn't a discrete time moment, because when we're doing things in this present, we are already anticipating or thinking about the future, right? And at the same time, it isn't as if we've forgotten everything that we've experienced in the past. So when we're moving through the world that we've been thrown into, we are, in effect, a person, a being of both the having been and the present and the future. And it would be really arbitrary to somehow separate those three in terms of our life experience, understanding, and even actions. But if enough of us are experiencing temporality that way, wouldn't it be more towards what Heidegger is hoping it will be? And that is not a subjective understanding, but it transcends individual subjectivity.
And not only that, I'm wondering because I keep thinking about the Hegelian concept of affinity. You know how like Hegel spent all this time saying like when is now? You point to a moment now, it's already gone. You can point to anything and it goes into these influxes of infinite points and like and it's what he called like, good and bad infinity. Like I think what he seems to be doing is kind of like moving the question away from like this moment in time right now is significant and trying to pinpoint it, and instead asking what the present seems to be associated with how we act out our design. So it's like there's the present is significant because the past has a component of our design of having been, the future is coming towards. In the present isn't this pinpointing of an actual moment as much as it is making something present with what we wish to be or how we wish to express our design. So he kind of shifts the question away from Hegelian present or when is like what is this moment in time from a phenomenology standpoint significant, and instead shifts it to us actually doing something or carrying out our own expression of design.
So what I wanted to say in response to Ed is that, and I put some of this in the chat. So Husserl and so Kant, all the German idealists, and then Husserl start with subjectivity because they think that what we know most clearly is what we experience immediately in our subjectivity. But then what they do is they try to find the ground of objectivity within that. So they do not conclude that everything is subjective. This is what drives Kant and Husserl to this notion of transcendental subjectivity, that there is this subjectivity that grounds the experience of every person, and that transcendental subjectivity has exactly the same structure for every person, which is why we all experience the world in the same way. So it's subjective in the sense that it only describes experience from our kind of being, but it's the same for all of us. And I think Husserl's doing something similar, but as Chase was saying, rather than in the domain of consciousness and subjectivity, he's trying to do it in the domain of being. And so all beings like Dasein, which is what we are, will structure being in exactly the same way in terms of these existentials, these fundamental structuring features that he's identified throughout the book. And so it's subjective only in the sense that he or any of us, there's some people who disagree with this, but this sort of phenomenological point of view is that he or any of us can only describe the structure of being from our structure of being. We don't have access to anything outside that. So it's subjective only in the sense that he's describing the structure of being as it but as it is for Dasein. But nevertheless, since every Dasein, and maybe he changes this later in his life, I don't know, but every Dasein structures the world in the same way, it does end up being a kind of ground for objectivity. And so all Dasein, understand the world not in this cognitive way, but in the way he means understanding. All of us are attuned in a certain way. Our understanding is attuned. All of us temporalize in the general same kind of structure. Temporality for all of us has the structure of having been, present, and future. And so it's not really subjective in the kind of like, I experience the world differently from you. I mean, there are features of my experience that are different from yours, that really are subjective. But I don't think he's, you got to be careful in the way you use subjective. Like, Kant's really bad about this. Sometimes when he means subjective, he's talking about transcendental subjectivity, which is really the same for all of us, even though it's subjectivity. But then other times he'll use the word subjective, like my subjective experience versus your subjective experience. And so Kant uses the word in both those ways, and he doesn't often tell you which one he's doing, so you just have to figure it out from the context. And it could be that that I think Heidegger's doing something similar again, that he's trying to describe these ontological structures of being in the world that just are what Dasein experiences, or not experiences, what Dasein is as Dasein.
Oh yeah, no, thanks for saying that, Nevin, because that's what I was trying to get across, that if I can borrow what you just said about the second meaning of Kant's subjective, like the universal subjective, if enough people experience a certain thing a certain way, then does it really make sense to call it subjective, right?
But they're not, phenomenologists are not basing it. So that would be basing it on some kind of empirical criterion where you say, okay, we get a bunch of people together and we all experience the world in the same way. And so we're going to draw up a set of features that are common to all of our experience. That's not what they're trying to do. And I'm more comfortable with what Kant is trying to do. I think Husserl's trying to do something similar. So what Kant does, he does not interrogate human experience. He doesn't go interview a whole bunch of people, gather a bunch of empirical data, and then drop some generalizations through induction. He does what he calls a transcendental deduction, where he looks at the structure of experience and asks the question, what are the conditions, the necessary, not that happen to be true for this person or that person, what are the absolutely logically necessary conditions for the possibility of me having this kind of experience? And those conditions include things like, well, my experience is always in space. My experience is always in time. My experience is always conditioned by cause and effect. My experience is always conditioned by unity and plurality. And so he's not basing it on an empirical study of how real, people experience things.
Right.
He's actually doing a logical deduction. And I think Heidegger's trying to do something similar, but instead of the domain of consciousness, he's doing it in the domain of being. What is the structure of being for this kind of being that I am? And then he does a kind of transcendental deduction and deduces that there are these fundamental structuring features, as Chase said. I mean, because he does use this term. Heidegger uses the term, I noticed it especially in last week's reading, the conditions for the possibility of. That's what transcendental means. Transcendental means the conditions for the possibility of. That's exactly what that word means. And so Heidegger's trying to do something similar. He's trying to figure out what are the transcendental ontological structuring features that make it possible for being to be this way, for Dasein. And so temporality, for example, it's not that we all get together and agree that we experience time in some common way. He's trying to do some deduction that proves that there must be this transcendental structure of temporality that makes it possible for us to even have an experience that appears as past, present, and future, and so on.
Well, how is that different than how is what Heidegger is doing with that transcendental deduction different from Kant, what Kant was doing?
Chase, you want to take that one? I could try to ramble, but
I think
I'll let Chase.
so. Kant, he was saying that the transcendental, the conditions that ground the possibility for things that, so calls himself a transcendental idealist. So
Kant,
the
right?
Say what?
That's Kant, right?
Yeah, Kant, right. That's what I said, right? Hopefully I did. Okay, but yeah, Kant is the transcendental idealist, and he's going to say that the conditions of possibility are going to be based in subjective aspects. But it's kind of especially complicated because there are empirical aspects of the mind that he also talks about. And that's kind of what Heidegger would call that ontic, or related to individual beings, rather than being with at least in the Iminar translation, capital B being. But Kant is going to say that it's subjectivity, this transcendental aspect of the mind, that's going to be what grounds the conditions for these things. But that's also because we have this shared structure of subjectivity. He thinks that that's what actually enables us to know empirical, objective experience. So we have an understanding of a general object based off the fact that, and we can share that experience with other people because we all have that same access to these structures of cognition. And that's what grounds the ability to. So in the first critique, he's interested in how do we just know objects, like facts of science and whatnot, mathematics. So Heidegger, he wants to instead. Okay, so the other thing about Kant is he's going to say we know appearances, but we don't know things in themselves. And ontology, for the most part, is kind of brushed to the side for the most part. Of course, there's tons of argumentation amongst the damn Kantians about what the hell is going on there. But for the most part, Kant himself is like, I'm not saying that, there's only being, say, in the transcendental thing in itself, and then appearances are illusory. He's not saying that. He's kind of like, ontology is somewhat just beside the point for Kant, for the most part. So what Heidegger wants to do is kind of return ontology to that question. So what is really kind of ontological for Heidegger would be those transcendental structures. So instead of talking about transcendental structures of subjectivity as the grounding, those as the conditions of possibility, instead he wants to say that they're ontological structures. And ontology also for Dasein is existence. So he's going to talk about them as ontological and existential. And so that's kind of the connection there with, he wants to do the same kind of transcendental thinking about, okay, you've got some kind of phenomena. How do we understand it? So we want to understand it by thinking about what grounds its possibility, what makes it possible that this is the case. Kant's going to say these universal subjective features, structures of cognition and whatnot. Heidegger's going to say that they're ontological, existential structures that do with our existence. So subjectivity for Heidegger. So yeah, well, you already explained this somewhat, but yeah, the subjective. So so what Heidegger wants to talk about. I keep wanting to say Husserl for some reason. So what he wants to get into in terms of these conditions of possibility and whatnot, which for the most part seems to be kind of temporality as the meaning of existence, which is also these conditions of possibility and temporality. But he'll talk about the everyday, the common conception of whether it's time or being, existence, the presence, things. So, that's kind of like what the Division 1 is mainly about, that this everyday interpretation that we have. But he's saying that is also inauthentic, and it shows itself not for what it really is. And Dasein loses track of what it really is in its own most authentic being when it's lost in this everydayness. So I think he'll talk about that kind of average sort of way of experiencing things, and he's somewhat critiquing it to a degree, but more so as, not that it's not a real thing or it's some kind of an illusion, but more that it tends to suggest and orient people towards interpretations that are just wrong. So, but he doesn't critique it as that those average everyday ways of interpreting things are subjective. Instead, he critiques those everyday those everyday ordinary ways of thinking about things as dependent on that distinction of objective and subjective, which he thinks is more derivative, and it's more something that comes with that inauthentic way of approaching things as a kind of subject encased in a mind that faces this objective world of objective objects.
But
So
even
he thinks,
even if he's uncomfortable and he rejects, it seems like what you're saying is he rejects the idea of subjective objective. He's uncomfortable.
Yeah, for the as at least as like primary ways of interpreting things. Yeah,
Okay, but if I don't know how to phrase it except using the word, but he has been asserting throughout this work of his that Dasein exists, right?
right.
But I mean, I
Only
think
thing that exists.
What?
And the only thing that exists, at least in the
Okay,
way that he uses the word exist. Yeah.
okay, but I mean, but it doesn't exist subjectively. It's not our understanding of this so it's not a subjective understanding of the existence of Dasein. So what else would you call it except objective? That it exists, but it's not existing because of our agreed upon social community, scientific, whatever group, community, polity, community we're talking about. Isn't he making an assertion of the existence of Dasein?
so. I think that the problem there is when you phrase it that way, you have already um, you have already presupposed that the primary concern is how a subject experiences an object. As soon as you say, isn't it subjective, you've made subjectivity the primary mode of encountering the world.
No.
For
What I was saying is, isn't he saying? I wasn't saying that. I was saying that he seems to be asserting the objective reality of Dasein.
But see, when you say objective, you're still importing as opposed to subjective. So when you use the word objective, you're already importing the notion of a subject who experiences an object, asking, is my experience subjective or objective? So you're already doing, it seems like what you're already doing is you're putting the question into a frame into Kant's frame or into Husserl's frame, because that's exactly what they're saying. They're saying fundamentally, I am a subject who experiences a world out there. I am a subject who experiences objects. And so the question is my experience subjective or objective? So by using that terminology, I
Sure.
think you've moved the whole question out of the way, out of the field, out of the framework that Heidegger is concerned with, and moved it into this, because you're speaking again in the kind of like consciousness. I am conscious of things. I have conscious experience. I have subjective conscious experiences. I have objective experiences.
Sure.
But I think, Heidegger's trying to shift from epistemology, which has to do with how do we know things. That's what Kant and Husserl primarily concerned with, shifting it into this ontology. And so, one thing, I'll read a comment I wrote up there. Kant is concerned with how we gain knowledge of the world. But this knowledge for Kant never gets at the being of things. All you can ever have conscious experiences of are the appearances. And those appearances are conditioned by this transcendental subjective structures like space, time, cause and effect, and so on. So my experience and therefore my knowledge is always conditions things such that my experience is never of the things themselves. It's always an experience only of the appearances. And the being of the thing is always hidden from me. That the thing in itself is never accessible to me. Whereas Heidegger wants to make, instead of a conscious subject, he's concerned with, I think that it just seems to me that that sort of transcendental subjectivity in Kant and Husserl is, at least in some sense, Dasein for Heidegger. So for Heidegger, this being is always in a world. And so it's not a matter of a conscious subject that is having conscious experience. It is this being, this thing that actually exists and exists in a world. And in that world, that being has encounters with other beings that are not like Dasein. And so it's not a matter of having a subjective conscious experience. It's a matter of this existential being encountering other beings in a world. So I think it's it's sort of a fundamentally different frame of reference. And so he's not thinking in terms of subject and object. He's thinking in terms of Dasein, which encounters beings in a world. And you could use the word objective. I think he would probably throw quotes around it, like he does sometimes when he's talking about using a word, but he's using it in kind of a conventional sense rather than in his special sense. It's objective in the sense that every Dasein structures the world in the same way, but it's not objective in the sense that we all have a common conscious experience. It's that we all are a kind of being that encounters other beings within a certain structural ontological framework. And what he's concerned with is figuring out what are the structures that condition this kind of encounter with beings. And so that's the way I think of a difference between Kant and Husserl and Heidegger is for Kant, this transcendental ego is, in a sense, creating these preconditions for the possibility of having a certain kind of conscious experience that conditions things. Whereas for Husserl, he's like, what are the transcendental conditioning features that make it such that this being encounters a world with this kind of structure to it? I don't know.
Can I say it a different way? If I'm understanding what you and Chase are saying, because I really am trying to understand this, are you saying that Heidegger would assert being precedes experience?
I believe so.
Okay, well then I kind of get it. Okay.
And in fact, in the last time when or in the last section when he's talking about care and the self, he pretty much explicitly says that the self, I don't know what I can't. I'm sure I'm going to fuck it up because I never get the vocabulary right and I say something that Heidegger would not say. But the self is secondary is not the right word, but care is what's kind of ontologically primary in Dasein, and the self is, I don't know the word, but yeah, what you said maybe just be a simpler way to put it.
Thanks. Thank you.
It's not that you start with subjective consciousness and then experience a world. It's that there is this being that structures that encounters a world with a certain structure, and then subjectivity emerges from that in some way.
Yeah, because in a way, what he's trying to do with talking about ontology, beings, and existence is he's trying to find something more primordial than the subject-object distinction that doesn't presuppose it. But in a way, you can see it as if you do look at it in comparison to that distinction, what he's doing is kind of talking about things that, at least seems to me, really are kind of an amalgam of what we would normally consider subject and object kind of things. Like the way I exist in a world, it's never really just completely subjective or completely objective or even some kind of confusing mix of these. It's really kind of, something that's in between to the point of preceding that distinction. And I think that's what he's trying to get at with So even something like experience, that kind of somewhat, I mean, this is definitely debatable, but the notion of experience, at least that we normally use that, would be something that presupposes a subject experiencing objects. And that's what he thinks. So that's to do with the whole present at hand or objective presence kind of thing, where what he's getting at, yeah, so Dasein, the being that we encounter other beings because we care about being, and within those beings that we encounter are beings that are not Dasein like beings. And that's where we get the idea of these things that are present at hand or objectively present. And then the mistake, I think, would be that we take the way that those things present themselves as objectively present, and we apply that to Dasein and say that Dasein is like an objective presence or something that's present at hand. And that's one of the main points I think he's making in this book, is that Dasein is kind of its own unique existence. It's really the only thing that exists. And he'll talk about so he will talk about, objective presence that way as something that kind of arises within Dasein's existence and encounters within the world. But he's saying, though, that it's kind of like this derivative sort of thing. And he's trying to give an explanation of how it actually comes about that we can have these misconceptions when we misinterpret objective presence and whatnot. And so he also has this way of talking about reality with a capital R. I'm not sure exactly. I think it's that way in the Stambaugh translation as well. But what he's talking about is like the world of nature, something like that. He'll talk about reality, capital R, and that's usually, I would say that's when he's trying to get at something like non-Dasein beings existing on their own outside of Dasein. And he does seem to say that, yeah, that is a thing. That is a genuine thing, that there is a reality, capital R, of like indifferent nature, besides Dasein. But then I think he still does the same thing, though, where he's critical of interpreting Dasein in terms of that capital R reality, that we would normally say that's kind of like what a sort of objective existence is, this existence of nature. But yeah, that part is a little confusing, and exactly like where does he exactly place this reality of nature that's outside of Dasein? It's a little confusing because he seems to, on one level, he's saying, I mean, this is a tension, I would say, in like all phenomenology, at least, because so you're trying to understand these things in terms of, at least in Heidegger's terms, things, yeah, why not? Beings that we encounter within kind of the open disclosure of existence, something like that. And then from there, how do we get from that to thinking about, okay, well, what about these same beings, but when Dasein isn't there? That's when it gets tricky, because in a way you could say like, well, there's no way to know because your methodology is based off Dasein being there. Literally, that's what it means.
Like the methodology is contingent on the human condition.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So it makes it tricky to think about, well, what would be this being, or even beings that we encounter within our human existence? What are those things outside of human existence? It's difficult to say even that, let alone kind of like, well, what about, I mean, surely there was some kind of exist, or some beings that pre-existed Dasein that made Dasein possible in some way. And it's difficult to think of those things without presupposing already a kind of Dasein-like interpretation of the world. And I think he would say, science kind of puts this question to the side and just assumes a kind of objective take on reality, that there's this kind of like independent structure of objective existence that we know through scientific means, and subjectivity is just kind of what can either, if it's working correctly, it just affords itself to understand exactly that objective, calculable aspect of nature or reality, capital R, and if it's faulty, then it doesn't. And I think that's another thing that Heidegger's definitely wanting to critique, is that kind of poo-pooing of the question of, well, what about Dasein in this? Not only can you not exactly just instantly interpret Dasein in terms of this objective, so-called this objective world, but also, vice versa. Well, what about Dasein's this reality exactly, this capital R? You can't really divorce it from Dasein. So at the same time, it's complicated. We have to understand all these things together, and yeah.
One way of getting at the non-primacy of subjectivity is to think about what Heidegger, when he talks about things ready to hand, I guess that's the one. When you're enmeshed in your activities and you're just doing stuff. So let's say you're third, like in really intense cases, like if you're playing an instrument that you're very skilled at, or you're playing a sport or whatever. When you're engaged that way, you don't have a real clear sense of self, and you're thoroughly immersed in the activity, and so your sense of subjectivity kind of it kind of just blends into your world that you're active in. And I think that's that's one reason why, where is the subject and where is the object there? Well, I mean, it's the sense of an atomic self that is distinct from the world, that is having, my subject in here is having an experience of the world out there. In that kind of experience, you don't have that experience. And yet there is a kind of subjectivity, or there is a sense of, like this experience is happening from a particular place in the world, from a particular set of conditions, of historical conditions, and so on. Yeah, that's all true, but that whatever that is just, like Chase said, kind of blended in with that whole world of activity. And so that, I think, for him, again, there's this tendency to say something like, well, the real world is that objective world where I am a subject and I experience a world of objects. And then you have this kind of weird experience where the self kind of fades out and you're involved in this. But I think Heidegger wants to say, no, that's the primary experience, is when you're really thoroughly engaged, and the self is kind of blended into the world. You're just being in the world and doing this stuff. And this other stuff is what's derivative. And so if you think in terms of subjectivity, if that's in that kind of experience, where exactly is subjectivity there? I mean, it's not so easy to put your finger on it. So that, I mean, I think that maybe is another way of thinking of this decentering of subjectivity. He thinks that sort of obsessive focus on the subject is kind of an artificial construct, or maybe not artificial, a derivative construct of something that's a more primary engagement with beings.
Yeah, I think it's kind of existence as this kind of engagement with the world and with other beings kind of cuts across that distinction and is the ground of it to the extent that it is something. He's not saying that it's a complete illusion. He is saying that there's a way of interpreting things theoretically through that distinction, especially when it's given kind of the most broad primary status. He thinks that's wrong, and that, but he's still saying that a basic kind of experience of the world in certain ways that, most people would talk about their experiences as, he's still saying that that is a genuine thing, but he just calls it the everyday ordinary experience or whatnot. And then, yeah, and he's going to talk about all these things in terms of temporality. And I think this reading, so we're already on the inauthentic, where I was having trouble with the authentic temporality, these ecstasies. And to some degree, I think reading the inauthentic version of them helped a little bit with the authentic, but they're still a little bit difficult to grasp. So one thing, I get the suspicion with Heidegger that he's talking about relatively, I'll call it concrete things, but he's doing it in his Heideggerian language, which makes it extremely difficult to get a sense of what concrete things he's actually talking about.
I keep a dictionary of terms in a little table and also a localized database because I keep using the wrong terms or have to remind myself what is he referencing in this new project and what is it. I lose track frequently.
That's why I'm always worried about saying the wrong thing, because all these words have special meanings, and they don't exactly mean the same thing they do in everyday language. And so, yeah, same.
Yeah, that's definitely a feature of Heidegger, and well, I mean, a lot of philosophy is like that. It's just, I mean, it's a difficult subject. It's just like, and but I think Heidegger especially I mean, this book it totally lives up to its reputation as, one of the extremely difficult. I don't know. I've definitely, these last like few times I've felt like, oh my God, like I don't know if I can go on for, I mean, it's only another 80 pages, but that 80 pages is starting to feel long. Like I think this book was probably 100 pages too long, or at least my patience is.
We can do it. We can do it.
'Cause I'm just like, oh my God, like,
No, so here's a primary problem I have in understanding this stuff. Is so many of these terms. Well, let me just take an example. So care, is this huge important term, but care as an ontological whatever is not the same thing as caring for things. And in fact, he's explicit about this. He says we are lost in the world caring for all these particular things. And so care, so that's kind of, I mean, that's part of inauthenticity, is being lost in the care for all these particular things. But then what is care as an ontological category? And then, I mean, this happens to me over and over and over. So, for example, with anxiety and fear, well, fear is this I think, is an ontic experience of like, I'm actually terrified right now. But anxiety is not, I don't mean this anxiety as an attunement is not the same thing, I don't think, as the feeling of anxiety. Now maybe the feeling of anxiety is predicated on the attunement of anxiety, but as an attunement, anxiety is not the feeling of being anxious. And so, kind of like care as an ontological category is not caring for these particular objects in the world. And so that's something I continually have trouble with, is trying to figure out what these terms mean, and yet somehow not interpreting them in this ontic sense of having particular feelings at particular times, or caring for caring for the cat, caring for the cup of coffee. I just, so if I wanted to just talk about one of them, maybe care or anxiety, like what is anxiety as attunement as opposed to the feeling of anxiety, or what is care as the being of Dasein, and how is that different from like caring for particular things?
Yeah, yeah, that one, that is confusing. Well, first of all, okay, the care thing, I think part of that, the Stambaugh translation of, okay, so my German isn't the greatest, but anyway, I mean, if you haven't figured that out by now, God help you. But Sorge, Sorge, that's care, and that's going to be, I think the that is the being of Dasein. Pretty heavy stuff there. But and that itself has it's articulated, so it has items to go along with it, to go along with the different modes of Dasein's being. So you've got one that's based off the future, which has to do with, oh God,
Understanding.
yeah, the understanding, yeah. Uh, well, the main one I was thinking, okay, so the for oh God, I can't remember what it is now. Okay, so in the Stambaugh, it's taking care of, and in the Macri and Robinson, it's concern. So the Stambaugh is confusing as hell because you've got care as, that's the big thing. And then taking care of is the really the main mode of it. But those are extremely different. And he wants to emphasize almost that it has to be understood as a mode of care that is not itself care.
So is taking
And
care like the ontic stuff of like taking care of things in the world?
yeah, for the most part. So it's that has to do with, like circumspection. That would be, I think that's kind of like our way of understanding, but that has to do with entities within the world, the being at hand, the ready to hand, and the present at hand, mainly the ready to hand, and the world as, these networks of significance and involvements and references and signs and all that are, so the average ordinary way that we're kind of dispersed in our world of concernful circumspection of these of other entities or beings, that's concern, which is it first Sorga, or no, I think I know I wrote it down somewhere. But there's also, the Oh, I don't know what this. Oh yeah, concern is. Oh my God, it's even more complicated. I because the Stamba also uses concern, but that I think that is for Zorga, and the Macri Robinson, that is solicitude, and that has to do with the Mitdasein or Mitsein, being with others, where so which is another mode of care. But to think of care in terms of these different modes, that's just kind of wrong. That's I mean, that'd be like thinking for Kant, it would be like thinking of the transcendental conditions in terms of the empirical. Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember what the one for in the Macker and Robinson, it's concern. But anyways, my point was is that the standby is confusing. I don't like that translation of taking care of. It just needs to be a different word. Concern. Good enough. So that causes a bunch of problems. I mean, even if, and then it's even so. I mean, it's especially complicated because we're using different translations.
But
So
do you
when
know,
I'm talking
Chase,
about concernful,
but do you know, Chase, if Heidegger used different German words, or did he use the same word that's being translated differently for showing care or something, and then concern or solicitude? Because sometimes, I mean, a much different philosopher, but Machiavelli uses the word virtue in The Prince consistently. I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And scholars have said, well, he really means these following 15 things when he uses virtue. It doesn't literally mean virtue. And so in many translations, it's the translator who decides what out of those 15 meanings he or she is going to use. Whereas Mansfield uses virtue every single time he stumbles across virtue in Machiavelli's The Prince. And so it would, you know what I mean? It would just be more helpful to me if I knew, did Heidegger actually use different terms or what? Because sometimes, you know, these philosophers will use that same term even if there is a range of meanings to it.
So what he's doing is so Zorga is going to be the main kind of term that is translated as care, and then these modes of care, they have the same word in it, Zorga, but they have different prefixes. Okay, so I looked it up. What is concern in the Macri Robinson is Besorge, so Besorge. So you see how it has that word Zorga in it, and so Heidegger is extremely conscious, of course, of etymology and uses that. And then the other one, which is solicitude in this translation, is Zorga with an umlaut over the U. So it has also the same the Zorga, but it's got the fur in front of it. So so it includes it, but he's showing that it's part of it, but also it's a modification of it, which is also the way that it works in his philosophy. So you see, you know, what Heidegger's doing with that. That's one of the reasons why I think this book I mean, God bless these translators. You know how I can only just reading this is frustrating enough. Can you imagine translating this? It's
apparently before Macri and Robinson translated it, it was considered untranslatable for several decades. Just people said you can't do it because he's depending so much because there's so much wordplay, but not in a trivial sense. But there's so much that rides on the etymology of the words and the way he's forming them and all that, that they just said, well, you really can't translate it. And maybe to some degree that's true.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think at least, well, actually, since Finnegan's Wake was mentioned on the Discord, that was another thing that was considered untranslatable, but people have translated Finnegan's Wake actually into quite a few different languages, which is pretty crazy. But yeah, it's kind of, any translation is going to be translation is treason or whatever the thing is, but which true, yeah. But then you're going to have, relative degrees of treason going on. Sometimes not always based off just that it's a bad translation, but that the thing that's being translated, it's just so much dependent on the structure of the actual language that's written in that it is difficult. You could translate it, but it's always going to leave more out than some kind of like a Harry Potter or something. And I think that, yeah, it's just extremely true for this one. It's because Heidegger is very much, that's kind of how he does his philosophy is through coming up with these words in which, in cases, a lot of these cases, he's using ordinary German words, and that's how he's bypassing mainly the Latin and French terminology of the translation of the tradition of philosophy. So that's how we can avoid using the terms that Bergson uses, because Bergson's French, and French is based off Latin, and you got Aristotle translating to Latin, and then basically from that, very much Latin-based words. So the German way of doing things is kind of, Kant, of course, he used some ordinary German terms, but he also used a lot of Latin terms. I think what Heidegger's doing is he's bringing back that some of these ordinary German terms in order to distinguish himself from that Latin tradition. But he's doing it in a way where he's kind of combining it in this, almost like scientific kind of manipulation of it to give it very specific philosophical senses. And I think that the care as Zorga, but then für Zorga, bis Zorga, and if you look at all the meanings of the prefixes, they all are very intentional. A lot of them he'll be kind of playing with different prefixes, and a lot of the terminology will be kind of like slight modifications of the word that follows, but have the same prefix. So he'll show kind of like where the continuity is between these terms by the way that he's named them. And that's something that will be very hard to replicate in English. Sometimes I think they do manage to do it. And I mean, I'm not at all aware of all these things. I think even if I read it in German, I still wouldn't. I mean, if I could, hopefully one day I'll be able to read in German, but probably a few decades probably until then. If I'm alive and able to read German, I think I'll be good. But yeah, anyways, this book is frustrating. I forgot what my original point was about, other than the care concern thing. There's one other thing I was going to say about something about what you said, Nevin. I can't remember though.
Well, I mean, I probably shouldn't have even brought that up, because as much as that was a real question, I diverted us away. You were trying to bring us back to temporality, which is the subject of this section, and then I said, yeah, but what about this? And then off we went. But so rather than try to figure out,
that's okay. I remember it was about anxiety and moods and
right, but maybe
attunement or state of mind. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it kind of goes back to that section I read earlier, on 3.3, for that very moment. And side note, I asked a German coworker for a specific word translation from Being in Time, and his mood went from "I'd be happy to help you translate German" to "Oh, this is Heidegger." So,
Yeah.
like, like, come on, Dirksen, please. But it's yeah, the whole and what's interesting too about mood in regards to temporality, I think to go back a little bit early, even earlier, Nevitt, when you were talking about ecstasy, the Greek term for ecstasy, ecstasis, is not just this euphoria, it's more of a standing out and coming out of yourself. So you see it used a lot in the Septuagint when people experience miracles or when they have this sudden onset of clarity. So if we can look at it, it gets a lot of weight and significance when you look at the present, the past, and the future of different terms of standing out and how that project of care, as you say, and your attunement as you're thrown into the world individuates you when it comes to the dread of how it's not going to become to completion or its significance brought into a holistic sense of temporality itself.
So a question I guess I would ask for maybe Chase is, and this is returning to something I said at the very beginning. So is part of this ecstasis have to do with Dasein as being, or I forgot how he puts it again, but being its possibilities or something like that, Dasein as projected toward the future? I mean, is that part of the ecstasis? Is this that Dasein is not like this thing that sits here in the present, but that Dasein is projecting into the future? Is that part of the ecstasis, or not?
Yeah, I think that's understanding.
Understanding, yeah.
Yeah, whereas so there's always some kind of understanding of, so Dasein is the being for whom its being is a concern, it cares about its being. And part of that is that it has an understanding of its being, which is normally a pre-ontological understanding, but an understanding nevertheless. And this it does in terms of not present objects, but its possibilities. So that's kind of one of the, I guess another one of the kind of like these main points that Heidegger emphasizes is that we understand ourselves even on a kind of, you can almost call it like an unconscious level, maybe, in terms of our possibilities. And yeah, that's part of that, also that future orientation. And so the way that temporality works is that it works in these ecstasies, in that any kind of an existential structure of Dasein, like the understanding, that one will be primarily oriented towards the future because it's trying to understand Dasein itself in terms of its possibilities, and the possibility that defines it is death, its limit point, the possibility of its impossibility, where it is no longer being. But because it's an ecstasis, it's connected with the other modes of temporality. I'm not sure if he actually calls them modes of temporality, but maybe aspects. I'm not sure. But so he'll talk about these different structures, like understanding. They'll emphasize one. Let's call it, yeah, let's go with mode of temporality, like the future, but it's always involved with the others. And then the ecstasis would be the fact that the future is then standing outside of itself also, in terms of kind of circling back to the having been and a present. And that's what he's doing with so all these, the ones that he's going into for this reading were the inauthentic versions of these existential structures that he connects with disclosure. That's it, yeah. Which are understanding, future oriented, falling or falling prey, or whatever it is in the stamma. That's oriented primarily towards the present, and that its inauthentic mode is mainly curiosity, I think. Curiosity. And then he's got like these descriptions of, inauthentic futures and inauthentic present, inauthentic having been, which are, this, what he's doing is, he's giving names for these things, and it's hard to keep track of all of them, but I think it helps at least in order you can get at least a sense of the basic structure of what he's doing in terms of, well, you got these structures of Dasein. They've got, all of them have these three modes of temporality connected with them. They emphasize one, but then also there's inauthentic versions of all of them. And in this case, the temporality is, you can kind of see it as also this transcendental conditioning aspect, or the meaning of it. So that's, I don't know, it's a lot, but
Well, here's
at least that's kind of like a basic structure of what's going on there, it seems like.
Here's another simple question for you then. This is in the section on the temporality of understanding, and he talks about the moment. So what the hell is the moment? So the moment is the authentic present, as opposed to the inauthentic present, which is making present. I mean, I think I understand the inauthentic moment. That's like you're just sort of conventional present. Here I am. It's the present. This is now. Is that correct? That's the inauthentic, pretty much.
Yeah, I think so.
It goes along with objective present. But boy, I have a hard time making sense of this, the moment. And just as a side note, this term Augenblick or whatever it is shows up in Nietzsche. It shows up in Goethe. We saw it in Goethe. I mean, it shows up in
Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard. Yeah, all over the place.
Even in Philip K. Dick, I remember I posted something like a passage from Philip K. Dick, and he talks about the Augenblick as well.
Really?
So it's kind of, I think it literally means I blink.
Mm.
And I think the Macri and Robinson translates it as moment of vision.
Hmm.
Which kind of makes sense. But I guess it's this moment in Stambaugh, I think.
Yeah. This moment, she capitalizes it, the moment.
Okay, yeah, so it's no capitals, but moment of vision and the Macri and Robinson. Yeah, so I think that has to go, that's kind of has to do with what he talked about previously, Heidegger, about the situation.
Mm.
But the way, yeah, this is one of these things that I don't think I understand this very well, but the best way I can think about it as authentic present is it talks about it as something like making the things that are actually present, it discloses those in a way that's connected with the future in a resolute manner, in this authentic way. I know it sounds like I'm defining it using the same term, but maybe I am. But so it would be the actual circumstances that are being encountered in the present would be encountered in the light of Dasein's kind of orientation towards its authentic future, which would be that authentic orientation towards its death, as that's its own most authentic possibility that individualizes it as it really is, I guess. And so to understand the present in terms of that possibility of my death, which is my own most authentic possibility, I think that would be the moment of vision. Kind of what this disclosure of the present in terms of authentic future, but then also there's the past aspect of it too. Of course, you can't forget that, which that has to do with. So I think he talks about that authentically as repetition,
Hmm.
which is interesting. But also it's about this kind of so the having been, that's about this thrownness, which discloses itself in a mood or attunement.
Hmm.
And so I think that the and anxiety is kind of that's the attunement that is orients you towards the authentic possibility of, authentic being. But it's interesting that he kind of goes into a little more detail about that, as it's what, so anxiety would be that attunement that presents authenticity as a possibility, but it doesn't fully kind of cross over into the moment of vision. It's only so, it's this anxiety is what anxiety is anxious in the face of is not any definite ontic being, but instead it's being in the world as an actual structure. It's
Hmm.
your actual, it's existence. So Dasein's own existence becomes an object. Oh, I shouldn't say that, but yeah, it becomes disclosed to itself by the fact that you get this kind of um not derealization, but a kind things that were normally, absorbed in particular things, but in anxiety, those particular things, their significance drops away. We don't, they're just like, okay, cool, a bottle of water, who cares? I don't know. I mean, that's not a very good description, but
I think of it
um,
as that sort of groundlessness that you sort of, when you, anxiety discloses the, um, again, maybe I'm thinking of it too much in Sartre's terms, but if there was a God, then that God could give me a reference for making sense of everything. But as thrown, there everything is, and it didn't come from anywhere, and and I just kind of showed up, and nobody put me here, and there's no you know, God-defined meaning or value to anything. And so that's the way I'm thinking. The anxiety is this kind of this encounter with the groundlessness, of just
mm,
being thrown into the world.
yeah, so
Yeah.
it's kind of like a mood that will actually show itself. It actually shows its own meaning and its own conditions of possibility, but exactly as a way that where most of the ways that we base things off of, we orient ourselves is around things in the world, but instead it's able to show that, well, the kind of the condition of all those things is actually not something that's within the world.
Hmm.
And so it's an ontic nothingness or indefiniteness.
Mhm.
And yeah, so what he first describes, okay, a mood as something, or so thrownness is not known as such, but disclosed far more primordially in how one is. I thought that was just a good description of, so thrownness, it's not known as such. I don't know is it the like Vince and wince, or I can never, those words I have trouble with. Um, but they don't, my thrownness doesn't show itself as, oh, this is where you came from. It's nothing like that. Instead, you're thrown into basically how you are, your mood. And that's where he's saying that is what the structure of the past in a way, but it's a way that's not kind of just sectioned off as some kind of a past present. Instead, the past is something that is always kind of ecstatically like pushing forward into the present towards the future.
Yeah, because
Which is
I don't
very
look at
Bergsonian, by the way, but yeah.
it. And again, to go back, like I don't look at my past and say this was significant. It no longer is. What I remember are things that this is significant to me right now. In the present, so like the past is my recollection of certain moments that are relative to my thrownness in this world at this moment. In the present is not some calculated series of events of A leading to B or some change of being. I don't think in that terms. It's not a very specific now. Here's the now and here's the now from before. It's 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 me creating situations relative to my projects to the possibility of the future that are only given weight by its temporality. So it's interesting how they're all tied together in that component. Like the like and what's even more interesting and you could lean more towards post-structuralism in this regards in the creative aspect. The present primordially is only significant to us when we can create, which is really interesting because we're creating situations relative to our authentic possibilities of being. And when you strip us of the ability to create, if desire is stripped of the creative powers, you strip us ontologically what it means to be human, which it kind of ties into the Deleuzian components, I suppose, a little bit.
Yeah, there's a bunch of weird resonances with Deleuze in terms of time and also the whole repetition kind of thing going on. But also part of it, I think, is so I've been reading this, The Origin of Time, Heidegger and Bergson. I've been reading some of that. And so basically Heidegger was like actually really very much read Bergson and based his own ideas on Bergson and kind of basically hid that. And so I think part of the resonances would be that Heidegger is basing his stuff off Bergson, but he's just not using French terminology. He's using his own Heideggerian terminology. Part of it, of course, well, Heidegger and Bergson still are, they definitely have different ideas and disagree about things, but there's a certain continuity going on there. He's taking his orientation from Bergson in a lot of ways in how he distinguishes things, but Deleuze is very much, he is a Bergsonian, and a lot of his ideas of time in particular are also from Bergson. So I think that's part of the reason why. But also I think, so Deleuze also read Heidegger and based a lot of his actual interpretations of Kant off of Heidegger's interpretations of Kant. So you see how there's all these complex ways in which they're, between the triangle, the love triangle, let's think of it that way, between Bergson, Heidegger, and Deleuze, you've got a love triangle with probably like some hate in it, mainly from Heidegger being a Nazi. But yeah, anyways. But yeah, some interesting complex relations going on there. And then you've got kind of these Bergsonian things like the preservation of the past into the present, where Bergson is very critical of that kind of, there's only a, infinitesimal now point, and the past is only just a previous past that is gone away, just flew away into nothingness. He thinks all of the past is preserved. It's preserved in the movement of time into the present, and that is also what is cutting into the future. So time, all those dimensions of time are connected in movement for him, and that's kind of like an ecstasis of time, right? Where
Yeah.
you've got, in terms of, you got this movement of all three kind of outside themselves, connected themselves. Is, yeah, like the openness of the future, how Bergson talks about it as, an openness is also what's conditioning at the same time the past as something that is like usually talks about as like a surging forth, a elan, a force, impulse. And then the present is kind of like what's stuck in between those in this movement. And that's where he's thinking, yeah, if you to try to understand the present without considering the past and the future, that is wrong. That's not the way to do it. And Heidegger's reading Bergson and coming up with these ideas and think their resemblance is not a coincidence. But at the same time, they're definitely, Bergson and Heidegger are definitely thinking a lot of ways differently. For one thing, because the early Bergson, so I just became very self-aware that I'm just like ranting about Bergson now. But anyways, so the early Bergson, he's still kind of like Husserl in that he wants to talk about it in terms of our immediate experience as conscious beings. So Heidegger is very critical of that, of course, which fair enough. But then the other thing is Heidegger basically like completely ignores Bergson. Like, is basically the book after his dissertation, which was completed in the 19th century, basically like stops there. And then you got, okay, well, what about you got three other major works, but especially really his two most popular ones, he doesn't seem to go into those at all. Not just as he talks about Bergson quite a bit in these other lectures around, both before being in time and then after as well. And there's a bunch of complex stuff with Aristotle that are involved too, but yeah.
Well, should we read Bergson in the future?
Hell
Not
yeah.
the far future.
Or the present, which is
Well,
grounded in the future.
Future as it's being anticipated in the present, with acknowledgement of the influences of the past.
With an understanding that we're going to die, so there's some temporality. We better make that reading list pretty a good project of care.
Yeah. Well, so
You have
Heidegger's
any idea about that?
Yeah, so Heidegger's interpretation of Aristotle is done in a way where he reads Aristotle in a way where Aristotle would be already anticipating Bergson's critique. So there's some pretty crazy temporality going on there. Aristotle probably didn't know that he would be used in that way, but
Fucking Aristotle.
that's
Almost
that's the nature of ecstatic temporality. So
How many more of these Heidegger seminars are we having? Somebody
It's
made a reference to 80 pages, so we're going to meet 3 more Mondays.
I think it's a little more than that because the last bits, the sections don't divide very well, except that I think in a way where you can only have, I think the last 2 weeks the readings are pretty short, although quite dense because it's,
Okay.
well, the last one has to do with
Oh, August 19th. Thank you.
Hegel's.
thank you. Hey, you know
The
what?
reason
I'd like
I
to
was
say
asking-
we've made good progress and we've always been here. So rock on.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up that I thought we had agreed months ago that we would just have one of our seminars connected to Heidegger dealing with the issue of Heidegger and Nazism. And I'm still willing to have that conversation because I think it seems to bubble up occasionally. since that time very early in our conversation about this book. And I was just wondering, would you still all be interested in, could we do that the week after the last, quote unquote, last meeting of August 19th?
So that would be the first Monday of classes at Texas State. I'm willing to do that, but I really would like to have a text.
Yeah, me too.
Rather than just talking about it in general terms, because I don't know. I mean, what I'm afraid of is it just degenerate into, people saying, well, he was, I don't know, but, just making emotional arguments that are not grounded in any kind of, history or text or anything.
I heard he ate a baby.
Right. So I mean, I don't know. I guess we can try to find something, but and the problem, I mean, and this may be, I don't know, we might have to look at more than one text, because the problem with finding a text is probably I'm guessing most articles are gonna fall into one or two categories, roughly. There's probably a spectrum, but one side of the spectrum is Heidegger was a Nazi. Everything he ever wrote was infected by Nazism. We should never read Heidegger. Fuck that guy. And then at the other extreme, you're going to have people saying, well, okay, well, he was a Nazi, but really he's doing something more fundamental that's really not related to Nazism. And you guys are just doing ad hominem arguments, and stop it. And so
Yeah.
roughly, and I'm sure there's a spectrum. So I guess it's good. I would like to have something that would ground the discussion. It may be difficult to find something that, is balanced in some sense.
I'll try to look something up. The thing is, there was one allegation made months ago that Heidegger actually influenced Nazism. And I didn't see how that was biographically or ideologically possible, since the party was formed in the 19 teens. And Heidegger, I think, I don't remember the year he was born, but the people who created the German Workers' Party never would have heard of Heidegger when they created it, and Hitler would not have heard of Heidegger when he joined the party a couple years after its formation, and all that. So
what I heard was sort of the reverse of that. What I've heard, the allegation is that Nazism influenced Heidegger, and so that Heidegger is, in fact, there was a guy when I was in graduate school, I didn't read it, but he wrote his dissertation on this claim, is that Nazism so infects the philosophy of Heidegger that it's irredeemable. That Nazism so infected the philosophy. So that's what I heard. I didn't hear that, Heidegger affected Nazism, but that Nazism infected Heidegger.
Right. Well, it was, I'm apologizing. I'm forgetting the man's name who has glasses, and he usually is here. And he was the one who said that Heidegger influenced Nazism. But I've heard more of what you said, Nevitt, in some quarters. And this book was published in 1927.
I'm sorry, I need to jet, guys.
Okay, bye-bye.
Well, it's after 9 o'clock, and so I won't belabor this, but I will try to see if I can't